You clicked on this video because you want to know how a broken child, barely more than a toddler, could possibly rise to become England's most powerful woman. You want to understand the exact, brutal path she walked, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will. This isn't the sanitized history you learned in school. This is the horrifying truth, pulled directly from contemporary accounts, medical records, and the shocking confession made by her own priest after her death. Prepare yourself because the story begins in unimaginable agony. The midwife's hands were slick with blood as she worked desperately to save the life of the 13-year-old girl, writhing in agony on the bed. For hours, the child, because that's precisely what she was, a child, had been screaming as her underdeveloped body tried to do what it was never meant to do at such a young age. The baby was stuck. The mother was dying. And in that moment, as death hovered over Pembroke Castle, in the brutal winter of 1457, everyone in that room knew the chilling truth that history would desperately try to forget. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant in the first place. This wasn't just a difficult labor, this was a catastrophe that would scar her for life, a physical and psychological wound that would shape the destiny of an entire nation. Her survival was a miracle, yes, but one born from an unimaginable horror. May 31st, 1443. A baby girl is born at Bletsoe Castle. Her name is Margaret, and from the moment she draws her first breath, she's not a child, she's a commodity. Her father, John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, one of the most powerful men in England, dies under mysterious circumstances within a year of her birth. Whispers of suicide spread quickly through the castle halls. In medieval England, taking your own life wasn't just a sin, it was a disgrace that tainted your entire family. And suddenly, baby Margaret isn't just an heiress, she's vulnerable prey. By the time Margaret could barely walk, the vultures were already circling. You see, this one-year-old baby had just inherited a fortune that would make grown men salivate, land, titles, wealth, all wrapped up in a package small enough to fit in a cradle. Her mother tried to protect her, even ensuring little Margaret received an exceptional education. For a brief moment, you might think this story could have a different ending, but King Henry VI had other plans. When Margaret was just 3 years old, the king handed her over like a prize to William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. The Duke immediately did what any predator would do. He married this toddler to his 7-year-old son, John. A 3-year-old bride, let that sink in. She probably couldn't even properly pronounce the words of the ceremony. The wedding took place between January and February 1450. They even needed papal dispensation because the children were related, which the Pope granted in August 1450. Even the Church was complicit. Her first marriage was a horrifying preview of the powerlessness that defined her early years. But the next chapter of her life would bring a violation so profound it would irrevocably alter the course of English history. Her first marriage was a horrifying preview of the powerlessness that defined her early years. But the next chapter of her life would bring a violation so profound it would irrevocably alter the course of English history. King Henry VI made the decision that would irrevocably shatter her childhood. He gave her to the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper. These men were ambitious, they were ruthless, they had the king's ear, and they had a clear vision for their family's ascent. When Edmund Tudor looked at 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, he didn't see a child who still played with dolls, a girl who might have dreams of her own. He saw a fortune, he saw a womb, he saw his entire future. The wedding took place on November 1st, 1455. Margaret was 12, Edmund was 24. Now I need you to understand something crucial here. Even in medieval England, where child marriages were sadly common, there was an unspoken rule, a grim understanding. You simply did not consummate the marriage until the girl was at least 14, preferably older. They knew the dangers. They had seen girls die. Edmund Tudor, however, did not care. Within days of the wedding, perhaps even on the wedding night itself, this 24-year-old man sexually assaulted a 12-year-old child. I am not using that word for shock value. I am using it because that is precisely what it was. Margaret could not legally consent. She could not emotionally consent. Her body was utterly unprepared for what happened to her. Edmund had his reasons, as cold and calculating as they were. In medieval law, if an heiress died without children, her vast lands returned to her family, but if she died after giving birth, her husband kept everything for life. Edmund looked at this tiny, terrified 12-year-old girl and made a monstrous calculation. The sooner he got her pregnant, the sooner he secured his fortune, even if it killed her. The sheer terror of what was to come now overshadowed every single day of her young life. And her ordeal was only just beginning. By April 1456, Margaret was undeniably, tragically pregnant. She was still 12 years old. Imagine for a moment being that age, your body suddenly changing in ways you don't understand. Imagine the terror of morning sickness when you're barely out of childhood yourself. Imagine trying to comprehend what's happening as your belly swells with a baby you never asked for, a life planted inside you by a man who saw you as nothing more than a walking bank account. But Margaret's nightmare was about to get worse, far worse. In July 1456, just a few months after her pregnancy began, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces. By November, on what should have been their first wedding anniversary, he was dead. Plague. Margaret was now 13, approximately 7 months pregnant, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. Most people would have crumbled, most would have retreated, but this child, this broken girl, made a choice that showed the first glimmer of the steel that was forming within her character. Despite being heavily pregnant, despite it being the depths of winter, despite the very real dangers of civil war swirling around her, she made the arduous journey to Pembroke Castle. She went to place herself under the protection of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. The journey itself, in her condition, could have killed her. Then on January the 28th, 1457, Margaret Beaufort's real ordeal began. Labour started. And immediately something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Margaret was tiny for her age, her hips hadn't widened, her body simply hadn't finished growing. The baby was coming, but there was nowhere for it to go. Hour after agonizing hour, the pain continued. This wasn't a woman in labor, this was a child whose body was tearing itself apart. The specifics of what happened in that birthing chamber are largely lost to history, obscured by time and trauma. But we can piece together the horror from what came after. The birth was so prolonged, so utterly catastrophic, that Margaret never had another child despite remarrying twice. Think about that. In an age where women routinely had 10, 12, 15 children, Margaret Beaufort only ever had one. Her body was so irrevocably destroyed by giving birth at 13 that it never recovered. The baby, by some miracle, survived. They named him Henry, the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But survival came at a cost that Margaret would pay for every single day of her very long life. The agonizing birth of her son was just the beginning of her transformation. What she endured in that birthing chamber fueled a lifelong obsession, a drive for power born from unimaginable trauma that would redefine the very fabric of England. The agonizing birth of her son was just the beginning of her transformation. What she endured in that birthing chamber fueled a lifelong obsession, a drive for power born from unimaginable trauma that would redefine the very fabric of England. Is it any wonder that Margaret's relationship with her son, Henry, became the defining obsession of her life? Some historians describe her devotion to him as bordering on the obsessive, a trauma response to having nearly lost both their lives. She poured every ounce of her formidable will into his survival, his success, and ultimately his claim to the throne. But here's where Margaret Beaufort's story gets even more revealing, even more heartbreaking. She tried to fight history itself. Decades later, when her own granddaughter, another Margaret, was betrothed to the King of Scotland at a dangerously young age, Margaret Beaufort fought against it with every fibre of her being. She and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, lobbied Henry VII frantically. Margaret's own son recorded her desperate pleas, noting their fear that the King of Scots would not wait but injure her and endanger her health. 50 years after her own ordeal, Margaret was still haunted. She knew exactly what not waiting meant. She knew what it did to young girls' bodies. She had lived through that brutal violation. And yet, even knowing this, the cold, relentless gears of the political machine ground on. Young Margaret Tudor was sent to Scotland anyway, married at 13, just like her grandmother. The cycle of sacrifice continued. Despite this crushing personal failure, Margaret Beaufort would rise to become one of the most powerful women in England. As the king's mother, she was a political mastermind, orchestrating the Tudor dynasty's consolidation of power, guiding her son Henry VII, and even ruling briefly as regent. She founded colleges at Cambridge. She signed herself Margaret R., as if she were a queen in her own right. But her immense success, her formidable intellect, her unmatched power, none of it could erase the trauma. She never escaped that room in Pembroke Castle. She never had another child. Her body never recovered from what Edmund Tudor did to her when she was 12 years old. Many historians have tried to sanitize this story, arguing about different times and different standards. But the chilling truth is, even by medieval standards, what happened to Margaret Beaufort was recognized as wrong. The typical age for marriage consummation was 14 at minimum, and often much later. Noble families frequently negotiated contracts explicitly forbidding consummation until a girl was older. The fact that Edmund Tudor flagrantly ignored these conventions, that he chose to impregnate a 12-year-old for pure financial gain, was shocking even to his contemporaries. Yet they let it happen anyway, because in the eyes of the king, the powerful nobles, even the priests, Margaret wasn't truly a person, she was property. They all knew what would happen to her, and they did nothing. This is the system that created the Tudor dynasty. This is the unacknowledged suffering that put Henry VII on the throne, and every Tudor monarch who came after, every single one, traced their lineage directly back to the anguish of a 13-year-old girl who nearly died because of a man's greed. This is the uncomfortable, inconvenient truth at the very heart of England's most famous dynasty. Every Tudor monarch who followed, Henry VIII with his 6 wives, Elizabeth I, the powerful Virgin Queen, they all existed, they all reigned because of the profound, unyielding suffering of Margaret Beaufort. Her magnificent achievements, the colleges she founded, her patronage of printing, her enduring mark on history, are often celebrated in isolation from this brutal origin story. Her suffering, the raw, visceral agony she endured, is frequently omitted from the glittering narratives of Tudor glamour. But this is the story that matters. This is the truth that needs to be heard, because in a world where child marriage still exists, where young girls are still traded like property, Margaret Beaufort stands as an eternal, agonizing reminder of what happens when we fail to protect children. Her survival was a miracle, yes, but it was a preventable miracle, one that should never have been necessary if the adults in Margaret's life had done their fundamental job and protected her. Instead, they sacrificed her childhood, her body, and her future children on the altar of political ambition and dynastic gain. She deserves to have her story told in full. Not just the powerful woman she became, but the broken child she was, because until we acknowledge the real cost of power, until we face the human suffering behind the grand narratives of history, we are, without question, doomed to repeat the same cruelties. Margaret couldn't save her granddaughter. She couldn't undo what was done to her. But maybe by telling her story honestly, by refusing to look away from the horror of it, we can at least honor her memory. The real Margaret Beaufort, the child who survived the unsurvivable, the girl who built a dynasty on the ruins of her own body. She was 12 years old, he was 24. It was wrong then, it's wrong now. And all the Tudor roses in the world can't make it right. Every time you see a portrait of Henry VIII, remember that he existed because a 12-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. Every time you read about Elizabeth, remember that her dynasty was founded on child abuse. Remember Margaret Beaufort, 13 years old, screaming in agony as her child body tried to give birth to the future. That's the price of power, that's the cost of dynasty, that's the truth behind the Tudor rose. It bloomed in blood, watered with the tears of a child who should have been playing with dolls, not delivering kings. She was 12 years old, and that should have been enough to save her, been enough to